Hello everyone, my name is Caleb Carr, and today I'm going to talk about something that's happening right now in the United States that most people have never heard of. And it's that Baltimore is experiencing one of the largest drops in homicide that it has seen in decades. And in a normal world, this would probably make headlines, but instead it's barely received national attention. So in this presentation, I'm gonna explain not only what's happening in Baltimore, but why this story is mostly being ignored. To do that, we're using concepts from intercultural communication, of course, along with some research articles from the Journal of International and Intercultural Communication. Alright, so let's get into it. So, over the past years, Baltimore's homicide numbers have dropped dramatically, more than 20%, and in some categories like gang violence even more. And it's mostly due to community-led violence interruption programs, new policing strategies, and strong local coordination that all play their major roles in keeping their neighborhoods safer. But despite this being one of the most significant crime reductions in a major U.S. city in recent years, the media response has been surprisingly silent. Many national outlets ran endless coverage when Baltimore's crime rates were so high, but now that the city is experiencing some real improvement, very few major outlets are covering it with the same kind of energy. And that brings us to the intercultural communication perspective, and that this isn't just a story about crime statistics, it's a story about how the media shapes cultural narratives, especially when those communities are of color. One major concept that helps explain this is framing theory. Framing theory suggests that the media doesn't just tell us what is happening, it tells us how to understand what's happening. News stories get framed all the time in ways that emphasize certain details and downplay others that are led to shape how it's perceived by the public. When Baltimore was struggling, the dominant frame was clear. It's urban violence, out of control crime, and just a failed city that's being ran by gangs. And the frame fits a familiar narrative that the audience has already recognized. Like, that's not a new concept. But when a city like Baltimore improves, the narrative gets disrupted. Like, there's no sensational angle. There's no fear to sell. It's because good news doesn't generate the same kind of emotional reaction, and it becomes less marketable, especially if it's like socially significant. This idea is supported by research. In this article called Framing Racialized Violence by Zing and Abru, published in the Journal of International and Cultural Communication, the author explains that the U.S. media routinely presents stories involving communities of color in ways that, quote, prioritize emotional intensity and public fear, shaping cultural perceptions more strongly than factual trends. And that lines up perfectly with what we see going on in Baltimore. When violence is increasing, fear-based framing makes it a national story, but when violence decreases, the story is no longer marketable, it no longer fits the media's agenda, and so the story just disappears. Another intercultural concept at play here is cultural narratives. Cultural narratives are the big stories societies tell about certain groups or places, and Baltimore is a majority black city, and for decades national media has framed cities like Baltimore, Detroit, and Chicago as symbols of chaos and societal dysfunction. These narratives became so familiar that they start to override the reality of the situation. Even when real progress is being made, it gets overshadowed because it contradicts the cultural expectations people have taught us to associate with those kinds of communities. So in other words, when Baltimore succeeds, it challenges that set narrative. Narratives are powerful, so they shape how we interpret events before we even personally experience what are facts. A third relative intercultural concept is ethnocentrism, which refers to viewing other cultures through the lens of one's own values and assumptions. In this case, many national news organizations operate with a perspective where urban black communities are viewed through a deficit lens, as places where violence are expected to improve are unlikely. So this kind of viewpoint makes it easier for the media to portray violence as normal, while portraying improvement as either unremarkable or irrelevant and unrealistic. When you combine ethnocentrism with like a profit-driven media system, you get a situation where negative stories are amplified and positive stories are minimized. Fear-mongering holds attention, and hearing about progress just doesn't. This again lines with Zing's and Abreu's research. They argue that radicalized media framing contributes to a, quote, distorted intercultural understanding of communities of color. That distortion affects more than just news coverage. It affects policymaking, public opinion, and the everyday interactions between cultural groups in America. So it brings us to the question, why does this matter? Why is this relevant to me? I don't live in Baltimore. It doesn't affect my day-to-day. Why is it worth mentioning? It matters because the stories we hear in communities shape how we treat those communities. When Baltimore's success is ignored, it reinforces harmful stereotypes and erases the work local residents and those leaders in the communities have been doing to create safer neighborhoods. It also impacts how we culturally understand violence. The media only covers crime when it goes up, but not when it goes down. The public develops a skewed view of reality. Believe things that they're always getting worse when they're actually improving. Intercultural communication reminds us that presentation shapes perception, and perception shapes culture. If media coverage only reinforces fear-based narratives, then even moments of progress can become invisible. So, to conclude, Baltimore's dramatic drop in homicides, it's not just a local victory, it's a case study on how media framing, cultural narratives, and ethnocentrism influence the stories we hear about different communities. By looking at this event through a intercultural communication lens, we can better understand why good news is sometimes just ignored entirely, and how the silence affects our cultural understanding of race, identity, and community across America. So yeah, that's all I have to say. Thank you so much for listening.